Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar Azure Kubernetes Service Facts, Myths, and Why It Is So Awesome. First of all, thank you to the Cloud Native community for having us. I'm really excited. With me, I've got my colleague Richard Hooper, and we're going to do a short introduction. I'll start with myself. My name is Wesley. I work at Intercept as a lead Azure architect, and next to that, I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP. I'd like to give the word to Richard. Please introduce yourself.
So I'm Richard. I'm an Azure architect at Intercept, based in the UK though, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP. My main focus day-to-day is on AKS.
All right, thank you. And we've got quite the agenda for today. We're going to talk about some different things, AKS related. I mean, why is it such a cool product to use, but also want to debunk some myths, want to talk about some facts, and how do you stay up to date with all that? Because you know, Kubernetes, it's a big promise, but it's also got a lot of big shoes to fill. So how do we deal with that? We work with it every day, and then how do we do it? How do we experience that? And obviously, everyone knows Richard as Pixel Robot. So if you've been doing any Kubernetes or AKS specifically, you must have heard of him. Great blogs. And I want to start talking about app modernization. So you might be thinking, all right, why app modernization when we're going to talk about AKS? But AKS, or Kubernetes itself, is actually an amazing product that will help you drive innovation and actually perform app modernization. And the reason behind that is that we need to ask the question, so what is app modernization really, or why do you want to do app modernization? And that answer is, well, there's no general consensus on what app modernization really is, right? It's a bit of a tricky thing. But normally you would say, like, if you are being limited by your infrastructure, by your technology stack, or anything else, being limited to do innovations, then that's when you need to do app modernization. App modernization, if you haven't done that before, it doesn't mean that you haven't been working on the backlog, right? Because obviously you've been adding customer requests or customer features or anything that will add value to the end customer. Obviously, you've been doing that, but you want to take that next leap. You want to take it to the next level, and that's when you do app modernization. And Kubernetes, and we're going to be talking about Azure Kubernetes, so the difference you will hopefully figure out somewhere along this webinar, but that is a big tool that will help you do that. So we're going to be talking about some myths and some facts, and we're going to show them on screen as well. We've got the first myth, if you will. So I'm going to be talking about the myth, and then let's ask our Kubernetes expert, Richard, what he thinks of that. So the first myth, Richard, is Azure Kubernetes Service is simply just Kubernetes hosted on Azure. We're going to say that is absolutely false, but why is that?
So the main core is Kubernetes in itself, but then you have all these extra bits that Microsoft have to put on top to make it run inside the cloud, to make it, more cloud native, to make it be able to scale your VM scale sets, to talk to your Azure AD, to, do all this cool integration with Security Center and stuff like that, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But so the core is, but then you'll notice like 1.22 of Kubernetes got released about a month or so ago. But the 1.22 version of AKS is only just gone into public preview. So if it was just vanilla Kubernetes, then they would be released at the same time. So that's a way to prove that it's not just vanilla Kubernetes.
So you could say that it's Kubernetes plus plus. It's Kubernetes and more.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. And then we've got another fact. Azure Kubernetes Service is just for developers. And I think that is when we talk about that big promise that Kubernetes has, That's like, all right, so you're a developer, you wanna build new stuff, you wanna containerize your solution. Let's do that. Kubernetes sounds like a really good product to do that. Azure Kubernetes makes that even easier. You deploy it, you've got it up and running. I think deployment is by far the easiest thing you can ever do. So developers can just get started right away. So that might suggest that Azure Kubernetes Service is just for developers, but we're going to say that is absolutely false. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely agree with you there. So the Azure portal and Azure themselves have made it so easy to actually create a guest cluster. Doesn't mean it's production ready, doesn't mean it's even ready for proper dev usage. It just means you've got a AKS cluster created and you can do some testing on it. You can deploy a sample Hello World pod or something like that. But really, the platform itself, you've got to think about there's all that underlying hardware or virtual machines or VM scale sets underneath it, which is typically an IT operations task of making sure they all work, they're all talking to each other, they got the right IP address ranges so they can talk to your other services if you need to link those up. You've got your VPNs if you need to VPN into it, your Bastion hosts, all of this stuff developers don't really care about. They just want to get their code up and running as quick as possible. So really, AKS, Kubernetes as a whole, is an IT ops platform to sort of make your developers' lives easier, but you still need a lot of IT ops people behind the scenes, making sure it always runs smoothly.
That is a very valid point. I also see some questions in chat that the sound might be a bit low. We're working on that, so bear with us. It'll get better. So back on the topic of it not being just a tool for developers, I think you touched a very valid point there. It is a tool that is really easy to use for developers. It's like a platform that will open up a bunch of features that we're all interested in. And containerization often starts with developers, right? They get into, let's containerize this, and then you start with one container. I've got a question here, so what if I only had one container? I mean, that is really where it starts, right? And then if you had one container, would you run it on Kubernetes? You would say probably not, maybe not. But the question behind it is, what is your plan?
Yeah.
So how is it going to scale? How is it, if you write one, surely you're probably going to write a bunch more. And that is when, you need to plan for it. And I always like to say, I love developers. I work with a lot of developers. But I always like to say, when they start using Kubernetes without any ops involved, at some point before going to production, you can't dev your way out of this. You need to look in, you need to look into the platform itself. And that brings us to the next myth, being Azure Kubernetes Service is an IT ops platform. And that's where we'll go. That is true. And before we give it to Richard to kick off on that, that is also one of the biggest challenges for IT ops people. And traditionally, we've been focusing on infrastructure management. But if you look at what a container does, and if you look at, the code is still inside the container image. The containerization itself, Docker, any other platform, but running it on Kubernetes is still a platform. So you need to manage that platform. The challenge is that we're no longer doing the point-and-clicking adventure. If we do Azure, yeah, sure, we prefer to do infrastructure as code, PowerShell, Azure CLI. But then when you start doing Kubernetes, even though Microsoft built the most epic interface for Kubernetes on Azure, if you ask me, because that was a really good improvement. But most of it is no longer the point-and-click adventures. It's just not there. You need to do it from code. So you're essentially being forced to write the YAML, understand the infrastructure. And that is one of the biggest challenges. And that's where we get the most questions. And I think if you go to Richard's blogs, he'll write about a lot of the IT ops stuff for Azure Kubernetes Service. So what is your thought on that, Richard?
Yes, I definitely agree with you on that. Before, as IT ops people, we used to deploy websites to IIS servers by copying code over, maybe changing a bit of configuration files, the web config and stuff like that. Now, what we're seeing more is developers are creating their container images, pushing it up to the container registry, and then it's our job as IT operations to actually ensure that the deployment goes successfully. So we have to create the YAML files, we have to make sure we got the right updates and the right amount of replicas, so that how many pods we want running of the same thing, if it can even be multiple pods system. We need to think about all of this way. We need to figure out, can we easily roll back if we need to? Ideally, we would roll forward, but will the developers have time, in their next sprint to actually be able to fix the codes with that's needed to roll forward? So we need to think about all of that kind of stuff. We need to create the YAML file. So instead of just writing infrastructure as code, we also need to understand YAML in all the right spaces. You've got to get those spaces in the right place, otherwise it all goes wrong. And you just got to understand the security side of it as well, because all of the demos you see online never talk about security. And you need to make sure you're not running your pods as root, because that's a big no-no. You got to make sure you got the right security context and stuff like that. Most of our developers we see just want to get that container out and that's it, on to the next thing. And that's where IT Ops definitely has such a big part to play in the whole ecosystem of Kubernetes and AKS.
Yeah, so build it and ship it, right? That's the goal.
Yeah.
Build it, ship it, good luck with it. Well, luckily, that is disappearing. So we actually do see more collaboration between IT Ops and developers. So would you say that Azure Kubernetes Service is actually making it easier for IT Ops as opposed to vanilla Kubernetes?
Yeah, definitely. So once you're over that sort of learning curve of Kubernetes as a whole, Azure Kubernetes has made it so much easier, because with the Azure portal, they've replaced the Kubernetes dashboard and created their own one inside the Azure portal. So even if you're not comfortable with the kubectl commands, you can actually go inside the Azure portal, see what's running inside your Kubernetes cluster, restart pods. You can even edit the YAML files, which I don't recommend in production, but you can in test and dev, inside the Azure portal to test a fix quickly, and then you can go back and update your manifest files and then push it through your DevOps pipelines and whatnot. But they've made it so simple to actually manage your clusters and your objects running inside your clusters now. It just, literally, you could get level 1 help desk people who have no Kubernetes knowledge in there to be able to restart a pod. And that's really cool. Like, that's one of the winning factors of AKS for me.
Definitely. And it also makes it a bit of a dangerous factor, right? Because it's so easy to deploy. I mean, think about the ops part. Think about how you're going to manage that. And I think, if you start if you start doing containerization, please plan ahead. But usually it starts with the great idea, and then it evolves into something really epic, which I think AKS is a great enabler for. And we got a question in chat, and that question is, I'll try to rephrase it. It's about Windows containers. So why would you use, in what scenario would you use Windows containers over Linux containers? So why would you prefer to use, in some scenarios, prefer to use Windows containers over Linux containers? And I think Rich has got a great scenario for that. He also talks about it a lot. But I think that also brings it back to that app modernization story. And if you look at that app modernization story, if you go to a customer, if you go to your internal organization and you're going to go, all right, we've got a legacy application running client server on-prem. We're going to containerize that. You're not going to do that overnight, but you're also not going to spend the next 6 months doing just that. So it's a continuous process. You have to have a good feedback loop. You have to do, I always like to say, do baby steps, and those baby steps will eventually turn into big leaps. And then Windows containers can be a really, really good tool to go from a legacy on-prem application to a fully containerized, based on .NET 5 Linux container configuration. You can all do that, but there's steps in between, and I think Windows containers play a good role in that. I think, Richard, maybe you could elaborate on a scenario where we did that.
Yeah, definitely. So let's think about, we've got this IIS web server, and we've got lots of customers, we've got lots of IIS web servers. They're all running, say, on Hyper-V in virtual machines. But you're getting to a point where you're getting more and more customers because you've got an epic app. And you've got to then speak to the bosses to get money, to get a new node for your Hyper-V cluster and everything like that. You can run it in Azure, but then you'll be running on VMs, and that costs money and everything. So what you can do is containerize your legacy IIS app into a Windows container, get that running up in AKS, because it can do that, nice out-of-the-box, super easy feature. And then once you've got that out there, you can just keep spinning up new pods with the new customers instead of setting up a VM, doing all the IIS config, everything like that, you've got your container image, and you just need to sort of inject your customer details into that image, and you've got you can onboard a new customer in seconds, maybe minutes, instead of weeks where you're waiting to get the new hardware or the VM set up by the other departments and stuff like that. So that's definitely a massive win with Windows containers. But like Wesley said, don't stop at Windows containers. Start looking at the app modernization and then go down that process. And hopefully you can run in Linux containers, .NET 5, .NET 6 soon, because I think that's coming out next month or so. So yeah, definitely look at Windows containers as a stepping stone to greater things.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that where in the beginning Windows containers, I always like to go about it as a bit sketchy. You run it, hopefully it runs. I think Microsoft put a lot of effort, specifically on Azure Kubernetes Service, to really integrate the Windows containers into the AKS concept, which made it a very stable solution. So it's not that you can only run it in production for about a month and then you have to move on. Now you've got time to plan the rest of your roadmap. And if you see what we got from with Windows containers, I think many years ago, I think it was about three and a half years ago, I was in this studio. Before it was a studio, it was like a big room for presentations. Jessica Dean from Microsoft did a session on containers and Kubernetes. And that the Windows container team was also present here, people from the product team. And they were still struggling with how do we fit the whole Windows thing into a container? How do we make it successful in the container world? And if you look at where they came from with the first tryouts for Windows containers on Kubernetes to Windows containers on Azure Kubernetes Service right now, I now feel comfortable doing that. Yes, we do want the roadmap for the long-term goals, but I do feel comfortable deploying them. And you see new features like Calico support, all the support, all the add-ons that Kubernetes has or that Kubernetes can do and that run on Azure Kubernetes Service are now also being extended to the Windows containers, which is pretty cool if you ask me.
Yeah, the Windows containers are definitely becoming on par with Linux containers now inside AKS. Windows containers is like a first-class citizen in the AKS world now, which is really good to see because it hasn't been like that. So yeah, they're just really good, and they're getting smaller and smaller as well. And there's this new feature coming one day soon called Teleport, which means your Windows containers, considering they're like 6+ gigs, will actually start up like a Linux container because it's using some crazy technology behind the scenes to get that image pulled down super quick for you. So I'm definitely looking forward to that, and that will make anyone's life running Windows containers a lot easier.
Yeah,
which is cool.
Definitely. All right. We've got another fact, and the fact is you can know exactly what's coming to Azure Kubernetes Service. We're going to say that's true, but why is that true, Richard?
Yeah, so the AKS team, they actually develop in the open source world, because Kubernetes is an open source product. So most of what they do in AKS and the features they bring in, they actually do it out in the open, and they want feedback from people, which is why they all do all these public previews and everything. You can actually see their roadmap in GitHub, so you can see all of that, see what's coming up, what's on the backlog, what's planned. You can put issues into it and say, this is the feature I want, this is why. They'll review it, triage it, and put it onto the roadmap if it's good enough. So definitely have a look at that. So you can actually know what's coming up by following. It's like a Kanban board. So you've got planned or backlog planned, in development, public preview, GA, and then archive because it's been GA for like 2 months. And then also you've got all their tooling. So like the AZ CLI, which is the preferred tooling for sort of AKS. And that's all done in open source as well, so you can actually go in there and look at the source code, see new features that are coming inside there, looking at the commands and all of that fun stuff, which I really enjoy doing. But yeah, so by sort of combining both of those, you can know what's coming in the world of AKS, and you can actually plan your workloads around that. So if you've got like, I really need this new debug feature, which I know is an alpha feature in 1.22, and that might be coming to AKS shortly, then I can plan my workload saying, right, that's cool, I will make sure I don't do that work until it's closer to when that's going live, and it's all good. So yeah, always have a look at that.
And I think to follow up on that, that's not something you do like an hour a week, right? I know
No.
you spam us internally with a lot of new features coming to Kubernetes, and you could say it's almost a day job to stay ahead. Later on, we've got Asheen, and we'll talk about how you can do that, because Azure Kubernetes Service is one of those services that you want to stay on top of. You don't just deploy and then see what happens in a couple of months. I think the versioning is a good one. You know, we're always following the public Kubernetes releases, so it's impossible to support a version that ran 2 years ago. So how does that work with Azure Kubernetes Service? How do you make sure that you stay in support, if you will?
Yeah, so basically, every time, about once a week, the AKS team actually release a new version of AKS. Usually it could just be a new node image with security updates, or it could be main features. But if you go to the GitHub repo and you can, like, if you just search for AKS releases, it's just like the first result in Google. And you just get all your release notes there. So it even tells you what packages they're installing inside the node images and stuff like that. And so in there, they would tell you if a version, so like 1.18 was depreciated a couple or so months ago. And inside these release notes, they were telling you, right, you need to make sure you're off of 1.18 by the 30th of this month because it's no longer in support. You can also go into the Azure portal, and when you go to upgrade your cluster, it tells you which versions are supported. So it will only show you the supported versions as well. But it's mostly a sort of manual process to make sure you are running that version and keeping yourself up to date with what versions are coming out.
So we don't have a sheet on that, about that myth, but let's debunk one myth. And I'd like to hear your thought about that. I mean, going to the Azure portal, going to your AKS cluster and clicking upgrade for a new version is enough. That I would say that's false, but you know, don't just go to the portal, click on it, go, let's do 121, and I'm done now. That's not true. I think that is one of those things specifically, for IT ops people. Even though you can upgrade AKS, there's much more to it. You need to understand the product. Like, what does that upgrade even do? And just upgrading the control plane, that's not enough. So Richard, question to you: if you want to stay up to date with your versioning, so not with features, but if you want to keep your AKS cluster up to date, what do you need to think about, and what do you need to plan for?
Yeah, so this one can be a bit tricky because obviously Kubernetes as a whole is constantly being worked on, constantly changing. They have just released, they changed their release calendars to 3 times a year for the major ones instead of 4. So you have less to worry about now. But they changed their API versions because, it goes through alpha, beta, and then production. So recently we had the ingress controller, which was in beta for such a long time, so V1 beta, and at the top of all your manifest files for your ingress, you have to put the API version number. So before it would be V1 beta 1, and now it's just V1. But with V1, that API changed, there's quite a few other changes that you need to do to your manifest file. So if I just went into the Azure portal, like Wesley said, and clicked upgrade, my ingress isn't going to work because that API is no longer available to me and it's just going to break. So you need to make sure you are understanding of what's changed in actual Kubernetes before you do the update. And then you need to go and check all of your manifest files, make sure that they're using the right APIs and stuff like that. So never go straight to production with upgrades. Do your dev test one first and then check it all, or just check everything first and then do it, because your developers probably won't like the downtime.
And I think that really, Azure Kubernetes really means that we, as IT ops people, we really got to start reading release notes. Like if reading release notes, and of course it was always important, but if it was important at some point in time, it'd be now when you're using Azure Kubernetes Service. And I think the product team did a really great job explaining. So if you read the AKS release notes, you'll automatically stay up to date with the overall changes in Kubernetes. There's like really good explanation of why and what is changing and why. So really recommend reading up on those all the time. Like, make it your weekly thing. Put it in your calendar. So what's changing in Kubernetes? Spend time on that, or in Azure Kubernetes. Now, there's a question in chat, and I think that is good to follow up with on the next sheet. And the question is, what differentiates AKS from other hosted platforms? So all the clouds have, a Kubernetes platform or a Kubernetes offering. So you would say that on Azure, the managed Kubernetes offering is Azure Kubernetes Service. What differentiates AKS from those other platforms? And I think that's got everything to do with integrations.
100% agree with you on that. So the integrations with Azure and, with Azure, that integrates so nicely with your enterprise IT stack. Most companies are running Active Directory, which you can synchronize up to Azure. And then from there, you can use the Azure RBAC controls inside your Kubernetes cluster. So you've got that nice full sort of integration path there just for your sort of role-based access control inside your cluster. You then got the nice integrations to other services like Security Center, storage, and everything like that. So it just ties everything nicely together. And another thing I think sort of outweighs why AKS is the better platform is we've got Brendan Burns, the co-founder of Kubernetes, working at Microsoft and overseeing the whole platform. So if he's not making it better, then we should have a few words maybe, but I'm sure he is, and he definitely is. So that's two amazing points why AKS is outdoing it. And obviously the integration with their Azure portal for managing your workloads is amazing, as we talked about before. And I would probably also say that they usually, and the last releases, they've always been the first one to the market with the new releases as well. So you're always getting the new features quicker. And, their support team is just amazing. So if you have an issue with AKS, or even like, say, with your Ingress controller inside AKS, the support team will actually assist you with that. Even though the Ingress controller is an open source software, they will actually go above and beyond to try and get you up and running and make your experience with AKS so much better.
Definitely, yeah. There are a lot of Azure integrations and a lot of add-ons also being worked on. You can find them on the product backlog. So if something's not there, it's public knowledge. You go in there, you register an issue, you post an issue, and go, all right, I need this, and they will actually look at it. So that's really good. So Richard, question to you: what is your favorite integration for AKS? Your favorite Azure integration?
So that's a good question. So my favorite one is probably the Key Vault integration, actually. It's a new one that's just come out as an AKS add-on. So it sort of talks to your Key Vault as a CSI, so like a container secret integration or something like that, or storage integration, and it mounts your Key Vault secrets into your pods as environment variables, so they're not stored as base64 code in your cluster, and they're only accessible via that pod. So that's really cool, and makes your life so much easier, so much more secure. You can do your key rotation as well for Key Vault and everything like that. So that's probably my favorite one. How about you, Wesley?
I knew you were going to ask that. My favorite one, I like the Key Vault one. I like security. It's the key rotation. It's perfect. It's just what we need. My favorite one would be Container Insights. And the reason behind that is, you have to be careful setting it up. If you've got containers logging a bunch of stuff that you don't need, then your workspaces will fill up quite quickly, and you don't want to end up in a scenario where your log analytics workspace is going to be 30-40% of your cost, so you need to be careful with that. But what Container Insights allows you to do is grab all the information that those containers are generating. So other than your kube events, you can have the STD error of your containers. And, we talked about it a lot, Richard. This allows you to do application-level monitoring. So you're no longer, even though Kubernetes is a platform, and Azure Kubernetes is a platform or a managed platform, you now have the ability, without too much work, it's literally like a next finish, and we have it as a best practice when we deploy it. I think Richard will probably refuse to deploy a Kubernetes cluster or an AKS cluster without Container Insights enabled. It allows you to actually see the behavior. So now you can go to your customer or to your internal development team going, hey, I want the container to generate logging that I can work with. So now you can actually detect what's happening inside the container and take actions based on that. So you can build automated workflows to to catch stuff, because if you're running containers, they can start, they can restart, a lot of stuff can happen, and you want to know all about it. And Container Insights is definitely one of the best tools I've seen so far that can help you do that. We've got a question in chat. When would you use Azure Web Apps, and when would you use Azure Kubernetes Service? That is an interesting one. Obviously, we're going to say always use Azure Kubernetes Service because it's the best. But no, there is, in terms of scalability, in terms of running updates. What if you've got 1,000 web apps and you want to update 1,000 web apps? That means you have to push to 1,000 web apps. Mm-hmm. If you do that on, Azure Kubernetes, you need to make sure that the image is there. But once it's there, it's a lot faster. And I think in terms of efficiency and overhead and pricing, Richard, that's also a big win if you could do that. But there needs to be a use case for it.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. If you're just starting out in the container world and you've got a web app, then try it on app services first, see how it works, see how it behaves. But then once you start containerizing your backend stuff and your middle bits, then maybe start looking at AKS as your platform. And obviously, if you are planning in your future to be massive and with all these web apps, then definitely look at AKS and maybe start off on AKS, because you can have a small cluster to start with and then just go from there.
So, and what about running a container on an app service?
Yeah, so you can run containers on your app service, so that's a good starting point in the whole world of containers. But as you said, if you've got lots of sort of apps running and each one's a container, each one has to be pulled down and it takes time for your upgrades and stuff like that. But app service and containers is good for web apps only. So just keep that in mind.
And a different subject, didn't discuss it for this session, but well, that's how we normally talk. Richard and I can talk all day and all the random stuff comes up. What about ACI? When we haven't talked about ACI yet, and I think if you look at Azure Kubernetes Service, one of the most powerful features that you have if you have an unpredictable workload is going to be ACI. Can you explain how that would work in a production scenario with AKS and running Azure container instances in the background?
Yeah, so you've got two options really. You can either attach what they call a virtual node, which is basically ACI, Azure Container Instances, inside your AKS cluster, and then you can sort of tag some of your pods to only ever run inside ACI. So if you've got a service or a job inside your Kubernetes cluster that needs to burst or only run certain time of the day or whatever, and you don't want a whole node waiting just to run it, you can burst to your ACI and it will run. Or if you have a container image you don't want inside your Kubernetes cluster for some reason because you need like maybe a VPN just to that pod, because you can run your ACI inside a VNet, then you can run it in the ACI, and then you can do VNet peering from the ACI VNet to your AKS cluster, so do nice secure communication that way. But one thing with ACI is it is per second billing, so make sure you don't keep it on and make sure the workloads are burstable workloads, and you'll keep your costs down. Yeah,
thank you for that. That's good. I think we'll see a lot of ACI integrations in the future with Azure Kubernetes Service being burstable, having unexpected behavior, unexpected workloads. Okay, so then we've got the question, how do you stay up to date with new releases and features? And we already talked about that a little bit, as in it's all open sourced onto GitHub. But there's more to it. There's more to it than just waiting for that email like, hey, there's a new version of Azure Kubernetes Service. You need to invest time in this. If you want to be successful in using Azure Kubernetes Service, you need to invest time in it, and that's not 1 hour a week. So it's like new versions are often released, but how do you figure that out, Richard? Can you elaborate a little bit on what you could do to stay up to date?
So to stay up to date with AKS, I would definitely, there's this thing called AKS office hours, which I believe is actually happening later on this evening, 5 o'clock UK time, 6 o'clock CET. And this is the global black belt team for open source technology as AKS, and they get together and they do this sort of office hours. So it's an hour long, every second Thursday, and they talk about what's coming. They get the PMs on, and they get the actual AKS PMs on, and they go over the roadmap, and you can actually ask questions, and they can answer it there and then. So in a way, it's a community, and you need to get involved with this community and talk to other people who are running Kubernetes, and integrate with them. Go watch webinars like this. Go read the books and read blog posts and tweets. Get on Twitter, because there's a lot of talk about it on Twitter as well. And not stop learning just at AKS, because Kubernetes and AKS is extensible. You've got your Nginx ingress controller. You've got Open Service Mesh, you've got all these other technologies that you can incorporate into AKS, and you need to learn about all of those to find out which one's the right one for you. So it's pretty much a full-time job to try and keep up to date with it all, but you also need to share what you're learning, and that's the key point. If you learn something, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with that community you're building, and just be nice and happy, and talk about it all with other people.
Be passionate, be happy, and ask questions.
Yes.
I think that would be a good way to summarize that. All right, so another myth. Once your cluster is deployed, you don't need to manage it. And, well, we already talked a little bit about it. I think that's false. But it also comes back to a question that we have in chat. How must the development team, or how much do the development teams and the IT ops teams need to adjust when starting to work with Azure Kubernetes Service?
Yeah, so it's definitely a shift in mindset. So my background is IT ops, but now I'm loving AKS. Before, like I said, you just sort of copy code to an IIS server and everything like that. That code is now, in a way, zipped up inside a container image. So your container image is your code, but it also has the runtimes and everything, all your like .NET frameworks and everything already in it. So you don't have to worry about that. So you need to. Before, we were writing config files, we were writing scripts to make sure we could deploy easier. So instead of writing scripts and that, we're writing manifest files, or working with our dev team to create the manifest files, making sure that they are doing what the dev team expects and what the IT ops team need it to do, stuff like that. So it's a big shift in your mindset, but once you start doing it, it becomes a lot easier. And really, there's not much difference to how we used to do things. It's just named differently. And, instead of writing a script or config file, you're writing a manifest file in YAML instead of PowerShell or Bash. And instead of a zip file, you've got a container image file. So it's not really that hard once you get your head around. It's basically the same, just a bit easier, because you haven't got all those dependencies to worry upon.
I think Kubernetes would be the prime example of why dev and ops need to work together. If you want to understand why, Richard, not sure if you read it, but go read the Phoenix project. It will.
Oh yeah,
it
awesome
will,
book.
From page 1, it will explain you why they need to collaborate, and that will also bring success to Kubernetes, to using Kubernetes. And to top it off, for ops people, well, for dev and ops people, you're not just learning about Kubernetes, you need to understand Azure. I mean, if we go back to those integrations, we talked about ACI, about storage integrations, the add-ons that Microsoft provides, Azure Key Vault, all that stuff. I mean, maybe you want the application gateway as an ingress. You want to use the AGIC, which works as well. You need to understand how that thing behaves. So you don't just need to know about, this is the control plane of my Kubernetes, of my Azure Kubernetes environment. These are my nodes, and they can be VM scale sets, and maybe using ephemeral disk. That's all fine. But what if you start using those integrations? What if you start using Azure Key Vault? How does Azure Key Vault behave? Did you figure out that you need to create permissions? You need to add permissions to Azure Key Vault on top of the RBAC stuff that you're doing? Are you doing managed identity? I think that is one of the biggest things you need to understand when using Azure Kubernetes Service. A lot of it is about managed identity, configuring it, and using that to leverage the integrations. That is something you really need to dive into. So it's not just about grabbing that Kubernetes book. And that is, Richard specializes in Azure Kubernetes Service, and he talks to us all day about all the cool stuff it can do, and we learn a lot. But it's also always got to do with the other stuff that Azure can do. So really invest time in in understanding Azure as well. That will determine whether you're going to be successful. And then, if you just do the Kubernetes stuff without leveraging the integrations, then you're missing out on a lot of stuff. That's just it'd be waste. You'll have way more success if you go with the integrations.
Yep.
So we just talked about this. It's good to have a list, staying up to date with the new releases and features. You've got the GitHub project, you've got the office hours, you've got the blogs, you've got socials, and you've got Richard doing YouTube shorts every day. So do check them out. That's going to be, that's always fun. I think it's a 1 minute thing talking about what he's been working on, what's new in AKS, and what you need to keep an eye out for. That's the kind of stuff you want to get into. But most of it is really reading the backlog and the issues on the project. That will definitely help you. So we're going to talk about upcoming features in a second. I've got a question for you, Richard. If you were to deploy AKS, what would be your number one best practice?
Oh, number one, apart from making sure Container Insights is there, making sure that you are, as you said earlier, leveraging all of the integrations with Azure. So you want to make sure you're using Azure RBAC to control the access inside your AKS cluster and to the portal version of the dashboard of AKS. So those two work nicely together. So I would say probably my most important one is making sure you are using the integrations provided to you, which are super easy to use.
Yeah. I would say do the Azure AD integration, the RBAC. Stop using --admin. Stop sharing the kube config file. Please stop doing that. Just stop. Don't ever. No, you actually need that Azure AD integration. That is one. I think that was probably one of our first best practices as well. Just you have to do that. Another one would be, but Microsoft solved that a couple of months ago. Always use CNI. Just don't go with KubeNet. Yeah. I mean, it works. It works for dev, but the thing with using it in dev means that if you use CNI in production, your development and your production environment are going to be different. So I would just go put it out there. Don't use use CNI. Just use CNI always. And then what's coming to let's rephrase that. What's coming to AKS that we can talk about? What are the future features you are most excited for? Because there's going to be some really epic stuff coming that we really can't talk about, unfortunately. But the stuff that is public knowledge, that's already really, really good.
Yeah. So obviously, KubeCon is next week, and there's going to be some announcements there, which I'm super excited for. And afterwards, we've got Ignite in November, so even more announcement then. But the ones that I'm most looking forward to is basically the top of the list is the Azure Defender add-on is getting sort of rewritten. It's going to hopefully run as a daemon set on each node, but it will hopefully also give us real-time scanning of our AKS clusters. So at the moment, it doesn't work very well with VMSS AKS clusters, and so they're rewriting it, and it sort of just scans your container images at one time or at your container registry level, and then it's more static at the moment. So this new real-time scanning, it's going to be awesome because you actually find out if there's a new CV on your AKS cluster on your running pods, or if someone's somehow managed to get into one of your pods, you'll know about it with this new Defender add-on. So that's the most exciting feature I think is coming to AKS.
Yeah, I just can't pick, man. I just can't choose. I really like the custom policy support. I like the policy thing in general because it's been a bit dodgy in the past. So I'm really looking forward to that. I also really like the subnets with CNI, the dedicated subnet, because it gives us more flexibility when connecting. So if you are a software company, you've got a bunch of customers, and those customers are going to be connecting to your environment. And if you want to, provide them different subnets, or maybe you're doing some single tenant thing, which also happens a lot on AKS, that will provide you with more options and more flexibility from a networking perspective. But I am really interested in the Azure Migrate support for Windows containers. So overall, the Azure Migrate support, I think we're coming up on time, but we have to discuss this. I just feel like we have to talk about the Azure Migrate support for containers to AKS. It is not the way, I'm just going to put this out there first, it is not the way to migrate everything you've got to Windows containers or Linux containers, just to be very, very clear on that. What it is for is, where I see the success in that is, hey, I've got an IS thing running. Can I containerize that? And it will give you, you talked about Windows containers as a stepping stone. Azure Migrate support would also be a stepping stone of containerizing your application. So you use Azure Migrate, you scan your application, you play with it, you generate the Docker file, and that's when you start playing with it. That's when you start fine-tuning your configuration and then write your pod definition, do all that stuff. So it is a stepping stone. So I do want to stress out that it's not just the complete tool to do a migration, but it is a really awesome stepping stone to do your first check. So I'm really excited about that going GA in the future.
Yeah, it's definitely, I love the way that it creates a Docker file for you. And then from there, you can actually build upon it and, it has what they class as best practices. So it has like permission resets and stuff in it, which you might not even thought about, but they're in this Docker file. So definitely check it out, see if your app can migrate, and then don't just use that version, but improve on it and then go to containers.
And that is good. That is a good example, the security configuration of your pod, because that also links back to the policy support. I mean, if you enable all that stuff, you're gonna deploy a pod, and it's not gonna deploy because you're not following the right guidelines. And I think if you already use Visual Studio Code and you've got the right plugins, it will already tell you, hey, your YAML needs, you need to have the right security context configured. But I think it's good that they then start with the best practice that you can build on top of. So we'll have more secure environments, and maybe just lower the bar or lower the challenge of going to a containerized environment.
Yeah.
I think that lots of good stuff coming to AKS, lots of good stuff. All right, that brings us to the end of this webinar, which I'm a bit sad about, actually. Just love talking about
this. It's been fun.
Yeah, we could talk about this all day, but we shouldn't. So if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them, send emails, ping us on social. We're always happy to help. I want to thank the Cloud Native community for having us. I really love doing this. We should do this more often. I mean, I'm up for anything.
Definitely.
Yeah, not sure about you, Richard, but I'm always up for stuff like this. I love it.
Next time I'll fly over and be in the studio with you.
You should. We're going to do that. We're going to do this again. You're going to fly over. We're going to be here in the studio together. That'd be amazing. All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you for all the questions in chat. Being interactive, it makes it better. It's awesome. And I wish you all a very, very pleasant day. Thank you.